What's going on, guys? Wanted to talk to you today about an aspect of multi-directional speed work that I still see as pretty commonplace, but I don't necessarily agree with, and that is forcing a line touch, or more specifically a hand touch down to a line during your multi-directional speed work. Now, there's a number of reasons I'll go over for that, but the initial easy reason I can think of is the variety of anthropometrics that we are encountering with our athletes. A taller athlete, for instance, has a longer distance to traverse to get that hand down to the ground versus a shorter athlete, and that might be more difficult for that taller athlete. Other aspects of anthros like longer, shorter torsos, legs, arms come into play in that same way. We also have joint workspace limitations or mobility limitations that are varied amongst athletes that then make it more difficult or easier for some to get down into a deeper flex position, being forced down to the ground versus others. Now, these are things that I don't think touching a line doesn't enhance the trainability of a drill or what I would be trying to get out of this multi-directional speed drill. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something related to balance and your control of center of mass. Now, if I'm doing a change of direction drill that's requiring me to run into that change, perform a 180-degree change and run in the opposite way, it's a pretty difficult drill, difficult change of direction. That's a high degree of change of direction. And what I'm looking for out of that drill after the acceleration is happening and I'm going into the change is I want to minimize the amount of deceleration steps and have those steps be as clean as possible. So these early deceleration steps from a high velocity, I'm accelerating to a high velocity and now I'm trying to quickly decelerate. I want to have the minimal amount of steps as I go into the footwork for the final foot contact. And I would love for those steps to be as high force as possible to make those forces as trainable as possible, enhancing that adaptation of reactive strength. Sometimes when I need to target a line that forces athletes to change their footwork, or they see the line and I have to sort of pitter patter into the line instead of having cleaner deceleration steps and then just having them perform the change. And if they sort of come short of the line or if they're over it, that's fine, as long as I'm seeing a clean final foot contact, and I'll go over this step as to why, into a directional step moving the opposite way. Same thing goes as if I was sliding into that change of direction. I would want these propulsive steps being clean and then have a clean final foot contact, push off, and directional step in the opposite direction. Now, if I require just in general a line touch and I'm targeting and focusing on that, as well as the hand touch, when I go to touch the hand to the ground, because I consider this a dynamic emergent task that's happening at high velocities, it's very hard to make each rep look exactly the same. So there's inconsistencies there, which is fine. That is what sport is. As we get more specific drills to the sport, that's just the name of the game. It's not going to be easy to be the same every time. Point being, when I go into that change and I require a line touch with a hand, what if I fall short and the line is over here? Well, that's going to require me to reach my hand outside of center of mass laterally to get to that line. What if I get my foot to the line and then I'm simply just trying to touch the line as well as get the foot touch? That hand might shift far out in front of me and tip me forward and get my center of mass too far forward. That makes me a bit unbalanced coming out of that cut or change of direction. A lot of times I'll see that turn into like a rounded cut. So instead of a clean staying on the line that you came from, because I haven't gotten great control out of my center of mass and my hand might be out in front, I may get too far on my toes, I may round out of that cut, which again takes away the trainability of this more general multi-directional speed drill. In the same vein, the other piece I consider is vision and where your eyes go during the drill. When I'm focused on a line, a lot of times I'll see athletes have to get their eyes down to the ground to see where their hand is going to the line. Now, in sport, that's not really what's happening. That's not where the action is. So I find myself cueing most of the time, an easy cue that cleans a lot of things up during acceleration, deceleration, is getting your eyes up. A lot of times I'll catch athletes, especially during acceleration, they'll be here, and when they push off, they end up dipping their head to the ground, and that acceleration turns into them keeping themselves from falling versus propelling themselves forward with their eyes up on the action, if you will. So if I'm requiring that target of a line, I am sort of requiring eyes down at the same time to search for that line. The same thing as I went over with the hand maybe getting out in front, center of mass tipping forward. That happens a lot when eyes go down, where we shift too far forward, center of mass, and makes it more difficult to have that posterior weight shift into hips, which is what we want. Now, the last thing I think about, and probably the most important piece, are the forces that the final foot contact or that plant leg is being subjected to if I'm expecting a directional step to be used during the drill. So if I'm running into that change of direction, to be clear on what a directional step is, I'm going to plant this outside leg, outside of center of mass, and this is going to serve as kind of your force driver, your motor, to push off in that opposite direction. And then this inside leg serves more as your rudder to direct yourself back on that same line. When I require a hand touch, I sort of muddy the waters in my opinion. And a lot of times when I see people running in really fast to that change, they'll shift too far to inside leg, and maybe they're using that hand touch and they're kind of getting unbalanced and out of control, and then we take away some of that force being subjected to the outside leg and we shift it to both legs, and then we turn this into more of a crossover step than a directional step. Now that sort of step might be fine, but this brings up how I think of these multi-directional speed drills. In my mind, I know these are more reactive strength drills, but if you think of these things, if I'm sliding into that change, as individual dynamic efforts that are like reps in your normal program of like 5 reps of a squat, then I want this rep, if I want the forces to be maximized on the outside leg, it's the same as trying to maximize the outputs during your squat. These are just reps of deceleration. So these dynamic efforts or reactive efforts of plant leg, 1 rep, second rep, and then this final foot contact is acting as a trainable rep. I want that to be subjected to the most amount of trainable forces. So that's what I mean by, like I said earlier, these steps being very clean into these changes. So in this final piece, I am thinking about the cleanliness of the kinematics as well on top of the kinetics. So the joint positions and shapes and the posture that you're getting into throughout that change of direction, or that you're showcasing throughout that change of direction, I want that to be as close to what I would want to see in sport as possible. So we want a good posture and some sort of stiff position here that is ready to take on forces and that feels stable on top of a stable base. So if I'm going into that change of direction and I'm muddying the waters with, oh, I have to target this line or I have to touch that line with my hand, that gets me kind of to this usually a more rounded back position. We might think that this is sort of challenging mobility, but usually what I see is more of like a hinge down to touch that looks like this. That is not something we would want to get into in sports. We want, like I mentioned before, eyes are up, we're in a good postural position, we have a stable base that does not necessarily need to be a deep squat position. We don't really see that in sport. If I'm thinking about basketball, or really sports in general, what do we see when people go into jumps? We see more of these shallower half squat positions. If I'm sliding or if I'm running into a change, I'm not really in these deep 90 degrees and below squatted positions. So I don't necessarily need to require that in that change of direction, and it muddies the kinematics as well. So if I go into that change, instead, I can just require a foot plant too close to a line, at least some sort of distance that I do want you to get to, or maybe you set up a zone of where you're going to want to change direction. If they get somewhere in that zone with clean footwork, that would be an indicator of success. And when I do that change, then I can just maintain my more sport specific posture, keep my eyes up, feel more stable, and then execute that directional step and go into that change of direction. So the cleanliness of the kinetics and the kinematics, I think, is increased without requiring a line touch or targeting with foot or hand.